In the heart of rural New South Wales, far from the reach of cities or neighbors, there lived a family hidden from the world. Generations were born behind closed doors, children who spoke in fragments, who did not know the outside, whose bodies bore the silent mark of bloodlines folded back on themselves. For decades, no one knew they were there. Tell us where in the world you're listening from, because some stories could happen closer than you think. The land stretches wide and empty in this part of Australia, a patchwork of scrub and paddock, the horizon broken only by the slow rise of distant hills. Here, the roads thin out, the houses grow sparse, and the silence deepens. It is a place where secrets can settle and take root, where the world's noise is little more than a memory. The Colt Clan made their home here, on a property so remote that even the nearest neighbors were little more than rumors themselves. The house was not a house in the usual sense. It was a collection of makeshift shelters, caravans, and sheds scattered across a clearing, ringed by trees and the slow, persistent hum of insects. There were no fences, no signs, nothing to mark the place as different from any other patch of bushland. But inside, a different world had grown. One shaped by secrecy, by rules that belonged to no one but themselves. For years, the family lived in near total isolation. Children were born and raised without ever setting foot in a classroom, without ever seeing a doctor, without ever speaking to anyone outside the family. Their world was bounded by the tree line and the will of the adults who controlled it. The children learned to keep quiet, to move softly, to avoid the gaze of strangers. They learned that the outside world was dangerous, that questions brought trouble, that silence was safety. It was not until the 2010s that the first whispers began to reach the authorities. A child, seen wandering near a neighboring property, thin and unkempt, speaking in a way that was hard to understand. A teacher, noticing a new student who seemed not to know how to hold a pencil, who flinched at the sound of a raised voice. A doctor, troubled by injuries that could not be explained, by a child who did not know their own birthday. The stories were small at first, easy to dismiss, easy to overlook, but they grew, and with them, a sense of unease. The authorities began to ask questions. Welfare workers drove out along the narrow roads, past the last of the mailboxes, into the bush. They found the property, hidden behind a tangle of trees and scrub, and what they saw there would haunt them for years. Children, thin and pale, with eyes that darted away from contact. Adults who spoke in half-truths, who seemed to have no records, no history, no past. The air was thick with the smell of neglect, of lives lived in the shadow of something unspoken. The first reports were cautious, almost disbelieving. How could a family live like this in modern Australia? How could children be born and raised without anyone noticing, without anyone intervening? The answers were slow to come, buried beneath years of silence and secrecy. But as the investigation deepened, the true horror of the Colt Clan story began to emerge. A story not of monsters or legends, but of ordinary people hidden in plain sight, whose suffering had gone unseen for far too long. In the end, it was not a single event that brought the Colt family to light, but a slow accumulation of small, troubling details. A child's awkward gait, a neighbor's uneasy feeling, a welfare worker's persistence. Piece by piece, the silence was broken and the world was forced to look at what had been hidden for so many years. The story of the Colt Clan is not just a story of one family, but a reminder of how easily darkness can grow in the spaces we do not see, and how the most disturbing truths are often those that hide in the quietest places. When the authorities finally crossed the threshold of the Colt property, they stepped into a world that felt suspended in time, yet marked by unmistakable signs of modern neglect. The air inside the makeshift dwellings was heavy, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and damp earth. The walls, if they could be called that, were patched together from sheets of tin and plywood, their surfaces stained by years of smoke and weather. There was no electricity, no running water, no sign of the conveniences that marked life elsewhere in the country. Instead, there were mattresses on the floor, piles of soiled clothing, and the scattered remains of meals eaten in haste or hunger. The children emerged slowly, wary of the strangers in uniforms and unfamiliar voices. Some clung to the shadows, their eyes wide and unblinking, while others hovered near the adults, seeking comfort in the only world they had ever known. Their bodies told stories before their mouths could. Many were small for their age, their limbs thin and fragile, their skin marked by sores and insect bites. Some bore the unmistakable signs of malnutrition: distended bellies, brittle hair, teeth rotted down to the gum. Others moved with a stiffness that spoke of old injuries left untreated, of bones that had healed crookedly, if at all. The silence was almost total. When the children did speak, their words came out in broken phrases, a private language shaped by years of isolation. Some could not speak at all, their mouths opening and closing in silent confusion. Others made sounds that were more animal than human: grunts, whimpers, the occasional high-pitched cry. The welfare workers tried to coax them, offering food, gentle words, but the children shrank away, unused to kindness from strangers. The adults, too, were wary, their faces closed and guarded. They answered questions with shrugs or silence, their eyes flicking from one another as if searching for a signal. When pressed, they insisted that the children were fine, that they were cared for, that outsiders had no right to interfere. But the evidence was everywhere, in the filth that coated every surface, in the makeshift beds, in the absence of books, toys, or any sign of learning. There were no school records, no medical files, no birth certificates for many of the children. It was as if they had been born into a world that existed only within the boundaries of the property, invisible to everyone else. The welfare workers documented everything. They took photographs, made notes, tried to piece together the family tree, a task made nearly impossible by the tangled relationships and the reluctance of the adults to speak plainly. It became clear that many of the children did not know who their fathers were, or even the names of all their siblings. The lines between parent and child, brother and sister, were blurred, folded back on themselves in ways that defied easy understanding. Medical examinations revealed more. Some of the children suffered from conditions that should have been treated years before: club feet, cleft palates, hearing loss, vision problems. Others showed signs of developmental delays, their movements awkward, their understanding of the world limited to what they had seen and heard within the family. There were scars, both old and new, and injuries that had never been properly cared for. The doctors and nurses who examined them struggled to hide their shock, their voices hushed as they compared notes and tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The authorities realized quickly that this was not a case of simple neglect, but something deeper, more disturbing. The children had not just been denied food or medical care, they had been denied the world itself. They had grown up in a place where the outside was a threat, where questions were dangerous, where silence was the only protection. The adults had built a wall around their lives, and the children had never been allowed to look beyond it. As the investigation continued, the true scale of the family's isolation became clear. Some of the children had never seen a car up close, never heard a television, never tasted food that did not come from a can or a garden. They did not know how to use a toilet, how to wash their hands, how to hold a pencil or read a book. Their understanding of time was vague, measured in seasons and the changing light, not in days or months or years. For them, the world was small, bounded by the trees and the rules of the adults who controlled it. The welfare workers left the property that first day with a sense of unease that would not leave them. They had seen poverty before, had seen neglect and abuse, but never anything quite like this. The silence of the children, the secrecy of the adults, the sense of a world turned inward on itself, it all lingered in their minds long after they drove away. They knew that what they had found was only the beginning, that the true story of the Colt Clan would take months, even years, to unravel. But already the first cracks had appeared in the wall of silence, and the world outside was beginning to look in. The story of the Colt Clan did not begin with a single act, but with a slow retreat from the world. Decades before the authorities arrived, the family's roots had already begun to twist inward, drawing tighter with each generation. The first to turn away from society was a man known as Tim Colt, a figure who would become both patriarch and architect of the family's isolation. He gathered his children and grandchildren around him, moving them from place to place, always further from the reach of towns and neighbors, until finally they settled in the bushland of New South Wales. Here, the outside world faded to a distant memory. The children grew up with stories of danger beyond the trees, of strangers who could not be trusted, of a world that would never understand them. The family's rules were simple and absolute. Outsiders were to be avoided, questions were not to be asked, and loyalty to the family came before all else. Over time, these rules hardened into something more than habit. They became the law of the land, enforced by fear and the ever-present threat of punishment. The adults controlled every aspect of life. They decided when and what the children ate, when they slept, how they spent their days. There was no school, no lessons, no books except for a few battered Bibles and old magazines. The children learned to read faces instead of words, to listen for the moods of the adults, to sense when silence was safest. They played in the dirt and among the trees, inventing games from scraps and stones, their laughter always hushed, always wary. As the years passed, the family grew. Children were born to mothers who were little more than children themselves, their fathers sometimes brothers, sometimes uncles, sometimes men whose names were never spoken aloud. The lines of kinship blurred, folded back on themselves until even the adults struggled to keep track. The children did not know the world outside, did not know that their family was different, did not know that the rules they lived by were not the rules of everyone else. The isolation was not just physical but psychological. The adults spoke often of the dangers beyond the property, of the cruelty of outsiders, of the need to keep the family together at all costs. The children learned to fear the unknown, to distrust anyone who was not blood. They learned that secrets were to be kept, that pain was to be endured in silence, that love and fear could be the same thing. In this way, the cycle of abuse was passed down, each generation teaching the next how to survive in a world that was both home and prison. There were moments when the outside world threatened to intrude. A social worker might visit, a neighbor might ask questions, a child might wander too close to the road. Each time the family closed ranks, presenting a united front of silence and denial. The children were taught what to say, how to act, how to hide the truth. The adults became experts at evasion, at telling just enough of the truth to satisfy, at making themselves invisible when necessary. Over time, the family's isolation became self-sustaining. The children who grew up in silence became adults who knew nothing else. They repeated the patterns they had learned, raising their own children in the same way, teaching them the same lessons, enforcing the same rules. The outside world became less and less real, a place of shadows and threats, while the family's world became all-consuming, a closed loop of secrecy and control. The abuse was not always visible. Sometimes it was a slap or a shout. Sometimes it was the slow, grinding neglect of hunger and cold. But more often it was the absence of everything a child needs to grow. The absence of love that is not conditional, the absence of safety, the absence of hope. The children learned to expect nothing, to want nothing, to survive on what little they were given. They learned that pain was normal, that confusion was normal, that the world was a place of danger and uncertainty. As the years went by, the family's isolation deepened. The children who were born into this world knew nothing else. They did not know that other children went to school, that other families lived in houses with electricity and running water, that other people celebrated birthdays and holidays. Their world was bounded by the trees and the rules of the adults, and they had no way of knowing that anything else existed. The adults, too, became trapped by the world they had created. They could not leave, could not ask for help, could not admit that anything was wrong. The fear of discovery was always present, a shadow that hung over every decision, every conversation, every day. They told themselves that they were protecting the family, that the outside world would only bring harm. But in doing so, They ensured that the cycle of abuse would continue, that the children would grow up as lost and afraid as they were. By the time the authorities arrived, the family's isolation had become complete. The children did not know how to speak to strangers, did not know how to ask for help, did not know that help was even possible. They had been born into a world of silence and secrecy, a world where the only truth was the one enforced by the adults. And so, when the outside world finally looked in, it was not just the conditions of the property that shocked them, but the realization that an entire generation had been raised in darkness, hidden in plain sight, their suffering unseen and unheard. The first medical and psychological reports on the Colt children read like dispatches from another era, yet they were written in the language of modern Australia. The professionals who entered the property did so with the tools of their trade, clipboards, stethoscopes, gentle voices, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found. The children, some of them teenagers, moved with a wariness that was almost animal. They flinched at sudden sounds, avoided eye contact, and seemed to shrink from the touch of anyone not their own. The physical conditions were immediately apparent. Many of the children were underweight, their ribs visible beneath thin shirts, their arms and legs marked by old bruises and scars. Some had deformities that spoke of more than neglect, features that hinted at the consequences of generations of close blood relations. There were children with misshapen jaws, cleft palates left unrepaired, and fingers fused or twisted in ways that made even simple tasks difficult. Several had club feet, forcing them to walk with a limp or shuffle, and others had vision or hearing problems that had never been addressed. Doctors noted the prevalence of skin infections, untreated dental decay, and chronic ear and respiratory infections. The children's hair was often brittle, their skin pale and marked by sores that had been scratched raw. Some had lice, others had scabies, and all bore the unmistakable signs of long-term malnutrition, swollen bellies, stunted growth, and a general frailty that made them seem younger than their years. But it was the psychological and developmental conditions that most disturbed the professionals. Many of the children could not speak in full sentences. Their vocabulary was limited, their grammar broken, their voices flat and monotone. Some communicated only in grunts or gestures, using a private language that outsiders could not decipher. When asked simple questions, "What is your name? How old are you?" they often looked to the adults for permission to answer, or simply stared in confusion. The older children, those who should have been in high school, had the understanding and behavior of much younger children. They did not know how to read or write, could not count past a handful of numbers, and had no concept of time beyond the rising and setting of the sun. They were easily startled, prone to sudden outbursts of anger or fear, and often retreated into themselves when confronted with anything unfamiliar. Some of the children displayed repetitive behaviors, rocking back and forth, humming to themselves or flapping their hands in front of their faces. Others were withdrawn, barely responsive, their eyes fixed on a point in the distance. There were signs of attachment disorders, of trauma that had never been named or treated. The professionals recognized the symptoms, the result of years without stimulation, without affection, without the basic building blocks of human development. The adults too showed signs of psychological distress. Some were sullen and uncooperative, refusing to answer questions or lashing out when pressed. Others seemed confused, unable to explain the simplest details of their lives. There was a sense of learned helplessness, of people who had been cut off from the world for so long that they no longer knew how to function within it. The boundaries between parent and child, sibling and cousin, were blurred to the point of meaninglessness. The family tree, when it was finally mapped, was a tangle of overlapping lines, generations folding back on themselves in ways that defied easy understanding. The reports documented all of this in careful clinical language. They described the physical deformities, the developmental delays, the psychological scars. They noted the absence of medical records, the lack of vaccinations, the untreated illnesses. They recorded the children's confusion, their fear, their inability to engage with the world outside their family. And beneath it all, there was a sense of disbelief. A quiet horror that such suffering could exist, not in some distant past but here and now, in a country that prided itself on its care for the vulnerable. The professionals who worked with the Colt children did what they could. They arranged for medical treatment, for therapy, for schooling. They tried to teach the children how to hold a pencil, how to brush their teeth, how to speak to someone who was not family. Progress was slow, measured in the smallest of steps. A child learning to say their name, another learning to tie their shoes, a teenager reading their first book. But the damage ran deep, and the path to healing was long and uncertain. The case files grew thick with observations and recommendations, with plans for intervention and support. But the reports could only capture so much. They could not convey the silence that hung over the children, the way they flinched from kindness, the way they looked to the adults for every answer. They could not capture the sense of loss, the years stolen, the potential wasted, the lives shaped by secrets and silence. In the end, the reports became a record not just of what was found, but of what had been lost. They were a testament to the resilience of the children, to the persistence of those who tried to help, and to the enduring impact of a world built on secrecy and fear. The conditions described were not the result of a single act, but of years, decades, of isolation, of abuse passed down from one generation to the next, hidden in the quiet spaces where no one thought to look. The investigators and medical professionals who entered the Colt property carried with them the quiet confidence of experience. Many had seen hardship before, neglect, poverty, the aftermath of violence. But as they pieced together the reality of the Colt family, that confidence gave way to something else, a slow, dawning horror, and a disbelief that lingered long after they left the bush behind. It was not just the squalor that unsettled them, though the filth was everywhere. Mattresses blackened with age and use, food scraps rotting in corners, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp earth. It was not just the physical suffering of the children, though that too was plain. The twisted limbs, the sunken eyes, the way some of them moved as if pain was a constant companion. What truly shocked the professionals was the realization that this was not a relic of some distant, forgotten time. This was happening now, in the 21st century, in a country that prided itself on its vigilance and care. The first days of the investigation were marked by a kind of stunned silence. The welfare workers, police, and doctors spoke in low voices, careful not to startle the children, careful not to betray their own unease. They moved from one makeshift shelter to another, documenting what they found, trying to make sense of the tangled relationships and the layers of secrecy. Each new discovery seemed to deepen the sense of unreality. A child who did not know their own age, a teenager who had never seen a book, a mother who could not say for certain which children were hers. The professionals compared notes trying to map the family tree, but the lines kept folding back on themselves, names repeating, ages blurring. The more they learned, the more impossible it seemed. How could so many children have been born and raised in such isolation, their existence unknown to the outside world? How could the systems meant to protect them, schools, doctors, social services, have failed so completely? Some of the investigators found themselves haunted by the children's eyes, wide, wary, searching for cues from the adults or else empty, as if the world held nothing for them. Others could not forget the silence, the way the children moved without speaking, the way they seemed to vanish into themselves when confronted with anything unfamiliar. The professionals tried to reach them, to offer comfort, but the children recoiled, unused to kindness, uncertain of what it meant. The shock was not limited to the physical and psychological conditions. It was the realization that the family's isolation had been so complete, so enduring, that an entire generation had grown up without the most basic knowledge of the world. The children did not know how to use a toilet, how to wash their hands, how to ask for help. They did not know that other children went to school, that other families lived in houses with electricity and running water, that birthdays and holidays were things to be celebrated, not feared. For the professionals, the case became a kind of reckoning. They pored over records, searching for missed opportunities, for signs that should have been noticed. There were moments, an unregistered birth, a child who never appeared at school, a neighbor's uneasy report, that in hindsight seemed like warnings. But each time the family had managed to slip through the cracks, their secrecy and isolation protecting them from scrutiny. The disbelief was not just professional, but personal. Many of those involved in the case found themselves questioning their own assumptions, their own sense of what was possible. They spoke of the case in hushed tones, even among themselves, as if to name it too plainly would make it more real. Some struggled with guilt, wondering what more could have been done, what signs had been missed. Others felt anger at the adults who had perpetuated the abuse, at the systems that had failed to intervene, at the silence that had allowed so much suffering to go unseen. The horror of the Colt case was not in its violence, though there was violence, nor in its poverty, though there was poverty. It was in the silence, the secrecy, the way an entire world had been built and maintained just out of sight. It was in the realization that such suffering could exist, not in some far-off place, but here, now, in a country that believed itself safe from such things. As the investigation continued, the professionals did what they could. They arranged for medical care, for therapy, for foster placements. They tried to help the children begin to understand the world beyond the property, to learn the skills and knowledge they had been denied. But the damage was deep, and the path forward was uncertain. The professionals knew that healing would take years, perhaps a lifetime, and that some wounds might never fully close. In the end, the shock and disbelief of those who uncovered the Colt family's story became part of the story itself, a testament to the power of secrecy and to the fragility of the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. The case forced a reckoning, not just with the family's suffering, but with the society that had allowed it to happen. It was a reminder that darkness can grow in the quietest places, and that the most disturbing truths are often those that hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally look. The story of the Colt Clan did not remain a secret for long. Once the first reports reached the desks of journalists and editors, the details, strange, unsettling, almost unbelievable, spread quickly through Australia and beyond. Headlines appeared in newspapers and on television screens, each one more incredulous than the last. Incest clan discovered in rural Australia. Children raised in isolation. A family hidden for generations. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Disbelief, outrage, and a deep, uneasy fascination. In towns and cities across the country, people asked how such a thing could have happened. How could a family live in such isolation, in such squalor, for so many years without anyone noticing? How could children be born, grow up, and suffer in silence while the world went about its business, just beyond the tree line? The questions echoed in Parliament, in schools, in homes. Talkback radio hosts and television panels debated the failures of the welfare system, the responsibilities of neighbors, the limits of privacy and intervention. The story became a kind of national reckoning. Politicians called for inquiries, for reviews of child protection laws, for new systems to ensure that no child could ever slip through the cracks again. Social workers and teachers spoke of the challenges they faced: overwhelmed caseloads, limited resources, the difficulty of reaching families who did not want to be found. There were calls for more funding, more oversight, more vigilance. But beneath the policy debates, there was a deeper, more troubling question. How many other families might be living in silence, hidden in the spaces between the city and the bush? Internationally, the story was met with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Foreign newspapers ran features on the Colt Clan, often with a tone of morbid curiosity. Commentators compared the case to stories from other countries, cases of hidden families, of generational abuse, of children raised in isolation. But the details of the Colt case were uniquely Australian, shaped by the vastness of the land, the thinness of its population, the ease with which a family could disappear into the bush. For those who carried the Colt name, the attention was a second kind of punishment. The stigma was immediate and overwhelming. Children who had been rescued from the property found themselves the subject of whispers and stares at school, their pasts laid bare for all to see. Adults who shared the surname, even distant relatives with no connection to the case, faced suspicion and hostility. The name itself became a symbol, a shorthand for secrecy, for abuse, for everything that had gone wrong. The media coverage was relentless. Journalists camped outside courtrooms, followed social workers, tried to interview anyone who had ever known the family. Details of the case were picked over, repeated, embellished. The children's faces were blurred in photographs, their names withheld, but the sense of exposure was inescapable. For a time, the Colt Clan became a kind of national ghost story, a reminder of what could happen when the world stopped looking, when silence was allowed to grow. Debates raged about the role of the media. Some argued that the coverage was necessary, that only by shining a light on the darkest corners of society could change be forced. Others saw exploitation, a kind of voyeurism that turned suffering into spectacle. The children, already traumatized by years of isolation and abuse, now faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives under the weight of public scrutiny. Within the systems meant to protect children, the case became a touchstone. Training sessions for social workers and teachers included references to the Colt family, warnings about the dangers of missed signs, the importance of persistence. New protocols were introduced, more rigorous checks, better coordination between agencies, a renewed emphasis on the welfare of the most vulnerable. But for many, the changes felt too late, a response to a tragedy that should never have been allowed to happen. The story faded from the headlines as all stories do. Other scandals, other tragedies took its place. But for those who had been involved, for the children, for the professionals, for the communities touched by the case, the impact lingered. The name Colt became a kind of warning, a reminder of the darkness that can grow in silence, of the lives that can be shaped and scarred by secrets. In the years that followed, the debates continued. Some argued that the case was unique, the product of extraordinary circumstances. Others saw it as a symptom of deeper problems, a society too willing to look away, too quick to trust that someone else would notice, someone else would act. The story of the Colt Clan became a mirror, reflecting not just the suffering of one family, but the vulnerabilities of a nation, the limits of its systems, the dangers of silence. And always, beneath the debates and the headlines, there was the simple, inescapable fact. For decades, a family had lived in isolation, their suffering unseen, their voices unheard. The world had looked away, and in that silence, darkness had grown. In the years before discovery, the Colt children lived in a world defined by silence and repetition. The days followed a rhythm set by the adults, waking with the sun, foraging for food, tending to animals, and retreating to the shadows when tempers flared. There were no clocks, no calendars, no school bells to mark the passage of time. The seasons were measured by the changing light, the chill in the air, the sound of rain on the tin roof. For the children, life was a series of tasks and waiting, of watching and listening, of learning to read the moods of those who held power over them. Inside the makeshift shelters, the air was close and heavy. The children slept in clusters, sharing thin blankets, their bodies pressed together for warmth. At night, the darkness was complete, broken only by the flicker of a candle or the glow of a dying fire. The sounds of the bush, wind in the trees, the distant call of an animal, were the only lullabies. There were no bedtime stories, no whispered dreams of what might lie beyond the trees. The world outside was a rumor, a threat, a place spoken of only in warnings. The adults spoke in low voices, their words often sharp, sometimes slurred by drink or exhaustion. The rules were enforced with a look, a gesture, a sudden outburst. The children learned quickly to be invisible, to move quietly, to avoid drawing attention. They learned that questions were dangerous, that curiosity could bring punishment, that the safest path was silence. In this way, The boundaries of their world shrank until nothing existed beyond the family, the property, the daily struggle to survive. There were moments of play, but even these were shaped by the limits of their world. The children invented games from scraps and stones, built forts from fallen branches, chased each other through the undergrowth. Their laughter was brief, quickly stifled if an adult appeared. They did not know the rules of cricket or football, did not know the songs other children sang at school, did not know the taste of ice cream or the feel of a new book in their hands. Their imaginations were shaped by what they saw and heard, the routines of the adults, the stories told in whispers, the ever-present sense of danger. Hunger was a constant companion. Meals were irregular, often little more than bread, tinned food, or whatever could be gathered from the garden or bush. The children learned to eat quickly, to hide food when they could, to go without when there was nothing. Illness was met with home remedies or ignored altogether. A fever might pass or it might not. A broken bone might heal or it might not. There was no doctor to call, no medicine to ease the pain. The children learned to endure, to accept suffering as a fact of life. Education in any formal sense was absent. Some of the older children had learned a few letters or numbers from magazines or old newspapers, but most could not read or write. They did not know how to hold a pencil, how to form their names, how to count beyond what was needed to divide food or chores. The world of books, of stories, of knowledge passed down from teacher to student was closed to them. Their learning came from observation, from imitation, from the need to survive. The relationships between the children were complicated by the confusion of kinship. Brothers and sisters, cousins and uncles, mothers and aunts. The lines blurred, the roles shifting with the needs of the adults. Some children formed close bonds, clinging to each other for comfort and protection. Others became rivals, competing for scraps of food or moments of attention. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken by a harsh word or a sudden blow. The psychological toll of this life was profound, though the children had no words for it. Anxiety, fear, and confusion were woven into the fabric of their days. Some withdrew into themselves, becoming silent and watchful. Others acted out, their frustration and anger erupting in sudden violence or tears. There was little comfort, little reassurance, little hope. The future was a blank space, unimaginable and unreachable. For the adults, the isolation was both a shield and a prison. They had built a world where their rules were absolute, where the outside could not intrude. But in doing so, they had trapped themselves as well as their children. The fear of discovery was constant, shaping every decision, every interaction. They told themselves they were protecting the family, but the cost was measured in lost years, in stunted lives, in the silence that grew heavier with each passing day. When the outside world finally arrived, when strangers in uniforms and with gentle voices stepped onto the property, the children did not know what to make of them. The language was strange, the questions confusing, the promises of help hard to believe. Some clung to the only world they had ever known, afraid of what might come next. Others looked at the newcomers with a kind of desperate hope, sensing that something was changing, even if they did not understand what or why. The hidden years of the Colt Clan were marked by a silence that was both protection and punishment. The children grew up in the shadows, their lives shaped by secrets, their futures stolen by the choices of others. The world outside moved on, unaware, while inside the boundaries of the property, time seemed to stand still. It is this silence, more than anything, that lingers, a reminder of what can happen when suffering is hidden, when voices are not heard, when the world forgets to look. They lived in plain sight, yet unseen. Their silence carried across generations until the world finally looked inside. But long after the reports and headlines faded, the question remained: how many stories like this are still waiting to be found? The Colt Clan story is not just a record of suffering, but a meditation on the power of secrecy and the fragility of the systems meant to protect. In the aftermath, the property was emptied. the makeshift shelters abandoned to the wind, and the slow reclaiming of the bush. The children, now wards of the state, were scattered, some to foster homes, some to institutions, all to a world that was as foreign to them as the surface of the moon. The adults faced courts and inquiries, their lives laid bare in ways they had spent decades avoiding. But the true reckoning was quieter, unfolding in the private moments of those who had survived. For the children, the journey into the world was slow and uncertain. Each day brought new challenges, learning to trust, to speak, to ask for what they needed. The simplest things, sitting in a classroom, holding a pencil, making a friend, were acts of courage. Some adapted, their resilience a quiet defiance of the years lost. Others struggled, haunted by memories that had no words, by fears that could not be named. The scars of isolation and abuse did not fade easily. They lingered in the way the children flinched at sudden sounds, in the way they watched the world with wary eyes, in the way they sometimes retreated into silence when the world became too much. For the professionals who intervened, the case became a touchstone, a reminder of the limits of vigilance, the dangers of assumption, the need for persistence. They spoke of the Colt family in training sessions and conferences, their story a warning and a call to action. But even as new protocols were written, as systems were reformed, there was an awareness that no system is perfect, that silence can still grow in the spaces between. The community, too, was changed. Neighbors who had once looked the other way now wondered what signs they had missed. Teachers, doctors, and social workers questioned their own practices, their own willingness to ask difficult questions. The name Colt became a shadow, a reminder that darkness can exist anywhere, that suffering can be hidden in the most ordinary places. And yet, for all the attention, for all the reforms, the story of the Colt Clan remains unfinished. The children, now adults, carry with them the legacy of their hidden years. Some have found ways to build new lives, to create families of their own, to break the cycle of silence. Others remain lost, their futures shaped by a past that cannot be undone. The world moves on, but the echoes of their suffering remain, a quiet testament to the cost of secrecy. In the end, the story is not just about one family or one failure or one place. It is about the spaces where silence grows, about the lives shaped by what is not seen, not heard, not spoken. It is about the questions that linger long after the headlines fade. Who is watching? Who is listening? Who will speak for those who cannot speak for themselves? The Colt Clan lived and suffered in the quiet heart of a modern nation, their pain hidden by distance, by secrecy, by the simple fact that no one thought to look. Their story is a warning, a reminder, a call to vigilance. For in every country, in every community, there are places where silence still reigns, where suffering is still hidden, where stories like this are still waiting to be found. And so, as the world turns its attention elsewhere, as the property is reclaimed by the bush and the names fade from memory, the question remains, unanswered, uneasy, persistent. How many more? Thank you for listening. Some stories linger long after the telling. The story of the Colt Clan is one that leaves us with uneasy questions about silence, about secrecy, and about the hidden lives that can exist even in the most familiar places. Now, I'd like to hear from you. What are your thoughts or feelings after hearing this story? Did it remind you of anything in your own life or community? What do you think we can do, as individuals or as a society, to notice and help those who might be suffering in silence? Please share your reflections in the comments below. If you have questions, insights, or even your own stories, I encourage you to join the conversation. Your voice matters, because stories like this are not just about the past, but about the choices we make every day and the silences we choose to break. If you found this episode meaningful, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Until next time, stay watchful, stay compassionate, and remember, sometimes the most important stories are the ones we almost never hear.